All right, welcome everybody. I think we get started. Welcome to today's ACOM Accord seminar. Our speaker today is Lynne Gratz. Lynne is an assistant professor in the environmental program at Colorado College in Colorado Springs. She did her studies, including her master's and PhD, in atmospheric and space science at the University of Michigan. After that, she spent 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow in the Italian National Research Council's Institute of Atmospheric Pollution in Rende, Italy. After that, she was a research associate at the University of Washington, Bethel, from 2012 to 2015, where she worked with Professor Dan Jaffe on the NOMADSS campaign, and I think a lot of us are familiar with the NOMADSS campaign. Several of us were on that. And now, as I already mentioned, she's assistant professor in the environmental program at the Colorado College. And today she will tell us about her research on atmospheric mercury from the boundary layer to the free troposphere, airborne observations of emissions, transport, and chemistry.
All right, well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, everyone, for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be able to come up from Colorado Springs and talk to all of you. I've had some nice conversations with colleagues here this morning, talking about my different activities that I have going on at CC. And actually today I'm going to tell you about the work that I did during NOMADSS, looking at airborne mercury measurements during summer of 2013. So some of you in this room were involved in that campaign, so you're familiar with the work that we did, but maybe it's the first time that I've been able to really share some of our findings as we're getting our papers out into the literature and kind of thinking about future work related to these topics. So if you aren't as familiar with NOMADSS, it took place, like I said, during summer of 2013 on board the NCAR NSF C-130. And on the right-hand side here, we have the 19 flight tracks that we conducted as part of the NOMADSS campaign. So I'll be telling you about kind of the M of the NOMADSS campaign today and the work that we did looking at mercury emissions and also atmospheric mercury chemistry. So I'll begin with just a little bit of background on atmospheric mercury. For those of you who are not as familiar why we're concerned about atmospheric mercury and what are some of the underlying questions that we have as we're thinking about this research. I'll talk about the NOMADSS project, and I'm basically going to focus on two of the NOMADSS flights as sort of case studies for looking, one, at source emissions, so flying around in the boundary layer and looking at outflow of mercury emissions from major source regions, and then another flight looking at mercury chemistry in the free troposphere and trying to understand the mechanism for mercury oxidation. And then I'll just conclude with talking a little bit about some of the new work that I'm getting started at Colorado College and some of my ideas for continuing in this field of atmospheric mercury chemistry research. So mercury is a bioaccumulative neurotoxin. It's emitted to the atmosphere from both natural and anthropogenic sources. And in the atmosphere, it's primarily in the inorganic form in relatively low levels. So mercury in the atmosphere is not directly what we're concerned about in terms of a public health issue or an environmental toxicity issue. The primary concern is once mercury gets removed from the atmosphere, either by wet or dry deposition. Once it is removed from the atmosphere in that way, it can get it enters into the ecosystem where it can undergo methylation, and methyl mercury, the organic form of mercury, is the primary form that can make its way up the aquatic food chain. So it's a bioaccumulative toxin. So, for example, once it gets into the aquatic ecosystem, it can get taken up by plankton. The little fish eat the plankton, the big fish eat the bigger fish. As we go higher up the food chain, some of these bigger fish like tuna and bass and swordfish, these are the ones that we're primarily concerned about in terms of having potentially higher levels of mercury in that fish tissue. But again, it depends where that fish comes from and what the levels of mercury may be in the atmosphere in those locations to begin with. So in terms of mercury as a hazardous air pollutant, we're primarily concerned about human exposure through these consumption of contaminated fish. Now, elevated levels of mercury have also been observed in other species in the environment, such as the common loon. So other species besides human have shown effects of this neurotoxin on their system. So in terms of thinking about the human health impacts, the primary exposure risk is to a developing nervous system. So young children and then also women of childbearing age are advised to be cautious about how much of certain types of fish they might consume, but also just communities that are highly dependent on fish consumption for primary dietary use can also be exposed to this particular health risk. So in the United States, all 50 states at this point have issued fish advisories due to mercury. So there's some concern about mercury levels in many of the lakes and waterways in the United States. And so we're just concerned about how that mercury is getting into the ecosystem in the first place, where it can ultimately pose this human or environmental threat. And that's really the primary focus of my research, is understanding what are the sources of mercury to the atmosphere and what happens to that mercury once it's in the atmosphere, and then how does it actually get removed and deposited to an ecosystem. So this plot here just shows you our sort of current understanding of mercury chemistry in the atmosphere and also within the aquatic ecosystem. So you can see over on the left-hand side that we can have emissions of mercury from both anthropogenic and natural sources. Mercury is emitted and exists in the atmosphere in different forms, and those emissions can vary depending on the source type. So the primary form of mercury in the atmosphere is gas phase elemental mercury. Elemental mercury, vapor phase mercury, is not very water soluble, so it can last in the atmosphere on the order of weeks to months. Some estimates even propose on the order of 1 to 2 years. So in that sense, mercury, if it's emitted in the elemental form or is in the atmosphere in the elemental form, is considered a global pollutant, because if it can last in the atmosphere that long, it can be transported globally. Now, mercury can also exist in the atmosphere in the oxidized form, which we typically write as mercury 1 or mercury 2. And we primarily think that oxidized mercury is in this mercury 2+ form. And that form of mercury can either be in the gas phase or bound to particles, and that form is much more water soluble and much more readily removed by wet and dry deposition. Now, there are a number of questions about that atmospheric chemistry mechanism. We don't fully understand yet how mercury gets from the elemental form into the oxidized form and what that oxidation mechanism is. There have been a number of proposals about that in the literature, but it's not entirely clear what that dominant mechanism is and what is actually doing the oxidizing. At the same time, we don't actually know what the chemical form is of oxidized mercury when we measure it. Oxidized mercury is in extremely low levels in the atmosphere, even lower than elemental mercury, and we don't actually have a measurement technique right now to measure the chemical forms of oxidized mercury. So when we measure it, we just sort of call it oxidized mercury. It can be referred to as gaseous oxidized mercury or particle-bound mercury, but it's this all-inclusive term. We actually don't know the speciation well at this point, but we have some ideas from observations and modeling and laboratory studies, and I'll talk about that a little bit today. But let's just talk a little bit more about emissions first before we get into the atmospheric chemistry. That's the first thing that I'll focus on today. So just to give you a little bit of the backstory on mercury here in the United States. So mercury was listed as a hazardous air pollutant under the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, which essentially required that atmospheric mercury be monitored and studied, and that we identify what the major sources are of mercury and address these major emissions of mercury to the atmosphere. So you can see that in the early 90s, the dominant sources of mercury to the atmosphere were coal combustion or coal-fired utility boilers, as well as municipal and medical waste incineration. In the mid to late 1990s, emissions controls were placed on municipal and medical waste incinerators in the United States, and you can see that those emissions have come down significantly over time, such that waste incineration is now a very small fraction of total annual mercury emissions to the atmosphere. On the other hand, coal-fired power plants have remained an important source of mercury to the atmosphere. They have come down over time, but they haven't fully been regulated yet. So here we can see in 1998, the US EPA required 95% reductions in waste incinerator emissions, and we can see the effect of that as time has gone on. But it was still necessary to regulate mercury emissions from coal-fired power plants. So in 2005, the US EPA proposed the Clean Air Mercury Rule, and actually the removal of power plants from the list of hazardous air pollutant sources. This was determined not an effective way to regulate mercury emissions to the atmosphere. The Clean Air Mercury Rule essentially proposed a cap-and-trade approach, similar to some of the approaches that have been suggested for regulating carbon dioxide emissions. The problem is that mercury doesn't behave in the atmosphere the same way that a pollutant like carbon dioxide does, and that gets back to this different chemical speciation that I talked about, that one form of mercury can persist in the atmosphere for a long time, whereas other forms of mercury, the oxidized form, can be removed very quickly. So if you regulate it using a cap-and-trade approach, you can end up with these hot spots of mercury very close to individual sources. So that rule was overturned, and the EPA needed to go back to the drawing board and find a different way to get at this. So in the meantime, up until recently, coal-fired power plants remain the largest U.S. source. You can see that they've gone down, but they're still a significant fraction of our total annual mercury emissions. Now, in 2011, the U.S. EPA put forth a new rule called the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards. This requires the use of maximum available control technologies to remove mercury and other air toxins, other heavy metals like arsenic, from coal and oil-fired power plants. That was put forth in December of 2011, and that actually goes into full effect this year in 2016. So you can see here, this is directly from the EPA website, demonstrating that by using this approach, using control technologies as opposed to a cap-and-trade approach, we can really clean up our power plant emissions and have a significant impact on human populations and the environment. So one would maybe assume that as all this has gone on over time and we've seen a rule that goes into place, that perhaps we have addressed the problem. We've reduced emissions from waste incinerators, and now we have something in place for power plant mercury emissions. This was a big step and was extremely important. However, it's also important to note that last summer, in June of 2015, a Supreme Court ruling effectively put the MATS standards on hold. It did not overturn them, but they argued that the US EPA did not effectively consider all the costs that would go into putting in these control technologies, and that the EPA needed to go back and prove that they had in fact done that. So you can think about the MATS standards as essentially being on hold, and this year I think will be an interesting year to see what happens with those standards and whether they are upheld. As I said, in April of 2016, the MATS standards are expected to go into full effect. So in the meantime, regardless of all of this that's going on, mercury still remains a global contaminant. And there's still a lot that we don't understand about what's going on with atmospheric mercury chemistry, the global scale transport of emissions, and we don't entirely know what the future of mercury emissions controls will be here in the United States. So that sets the stage for the work that we did in 2013 as part of the NOMADSS campaign. As part of NOMADSS, we were based in central Tennessee. This campaign took place in June and July of 2013, and we conducted 19 research flights over the course of that time period. The C-130 had a wide range of instruments on board. Many of you were involved in operating some of those instruments. And there was a wide range of scientific questions that were posed as part of NOMADSS, which you can probably gather, or you may know just from reading the title of our project, that this was not just a mercury campaign. We were looking at a lot of different things. So not every one of those 19 research flights was specifically focused on the mercury questions that we were seeking to address, but we've been able to use that data to look at some of the questions that I've mentioned to you so far today. So on board the C-130, we had the University of Washington's Detector for Oxidized Mercury Species, or the UW-DOGS. I did not name this instrument, but if you are a sports fan at all, you know that the University of Washington's mascot is the Husky. So Dan and his group members came up with a way that they could name their instrument the UW-DOGS. This is a dual-channel instrument. So you can see here our inlet going out of the side of the C-130. It's a heated sample line. As air is brought in along that heated sample line, we sample off of it with two different channels. One channel is a total mercury channel, which is the channel that has the pyrolyzer there on the left. So that as the airstream goes through that pyrolyzer, all of the oxidized forms of mercury are converted over to elemental mercury. And the analyzer downstream measures which is only able to measure elemental mercury, measures total mercury in the sample stream. On the other channel, instead of a pyrolyzer, we have an oxidized mercury scrubbing material. So that trap removes all oxidized mercury from the sample stream, and on that channel we measure only elemental mercury. So we measure simultaneously total mercury and elemental mercury. By taking the difference between the two, we're able to quantify oxidized mercury. Our sampling resolution is 2.5 minutes. We calibrate this instrument in flight using an elemental mercury permeation source, and we also calibrate it in the laboratory before and after the campaign using mercury bromide as a surrogate for the forms of oxidized mercury that we're measuring in the atmosphere. And here on the right, you can see a picture of the C-130, or of the dogs as installed on the C-130 during NOMADSS. So just to kind of recap what I said at the start, we kind of had two major objectives for the mercury portion of the NOMADSS campaign. One is to constrain mercury emissions from major emission sources and source regions, and the second was to identify the mechanism for enhanced oxidized mercury in the free troposphere. Several studies have done measurements of mercury at high elevation sites or from aircraft and have suggested that oxidized mercury is enhanced in the free troposphere. Modeling studies suggest the same thing, and we wanted to better understand why that might be the case and see if this is in fact true. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to use two flights from NOMADSS to talk about these two different but very much related, linked scientific questions that we had as part of NOMADSS. So beginning with looking at mercury emissions in transport. As I mentioned, we have both natural and anthropogenic sources of mercury to the atmosphere. Different point sources emit different total amounts of mercury, but also different fractions of the elemental and oxidized forms of mercury. And we really wanted to understand from an individual point source or a source region, what is the enhancement of atmospheric mercury as a result of those emissions. So my colleague Jesse Ambrose was a postdoc at the University of Washington, Bothell at the same time that I was there, and we worked on the NOMADSS campaign together. So Jesse's work from NOMADSS really focused on looking at point source emissions and checking what we were measuring on board the C-130 with what is being reported for those specific point sources in the National Emissions Inventory. So I want to talk briefly about that because that sets the stage for the method that I then used to look at emissions from a larger source region. So here's just some images from Jesse's paper that came out in Environmental Science and Technology last year, where as we flew through the plumes of 6 different power plants, 6 different coal-fired power plants in the eastern U.S. as part of NOMADSS, he used the concurrent measurements of carbon dioxide, NOx, and SO2, and he computed measured enhancement ratios using the mercury measurements and these other species. So for example, on the left-hand side, we can see on the y-axis the measurements of total mercury relative to CO2, and he used this to calculate a sort of enhancement ratio as we pass through the plume of each of these individual power plants. What he then did was go back to the National Emissions Inventory and computed these inventory-based emissions ratios. So for any given power plant, you can look up what their annual emissions are of mercury and CO2. And he, I won't go into much more detail than that, but he computed, again, these emissions ratios and compared what we observed to what he determined to be reported in the inventory. What he found is that the inventory was biased low by about 39% for these 6 different power plants that he looked at, biased low for total mercury emissions. And so we wanted to see, this is a very important finding, right, because we use the National Emissions Inventory to compute those bar graphs that I looked at earlier showing how mercury emissions have come down. His work suggests that it's possible, at least for the 6 plants that he looked at, and one could maybe presume that this is true for many other plants in the United States, that the inventory is significantly low in its annual emissions reporting. So what we wanted to do is see if we could use a similar approach, as I said, to look at the outflow of mercury from a particular source region. And to do that, I used NOMADSS Research Flight 15, where we spent a significant amount of time flying downwind of the Chicago-Gary urban area, which is a known, highly industrialized urban area, and a lot of work has already been done using ground-based measurements to see the effect of mercury emissions from that area. But this was the first time we could look at that from an airborne platform. So this is actually some work that I did as a graduate student at the University of Michigan, looking at the impact of the Chicago-Gary urban industrial area on the western side of the state of Michigan. So I had 2 ground-based sites, one in Chicago and one in Holland, Michigan, about 100, a little more than 100 kilometers downwind of Chicago on the western side, or eastern side of Lake Michigan, the western side of the state of Michigan. And using continuous measurements over the course of a summer, we determined that the Chicago-Gary area has a significant impact on the lake and on downwind environments. And this has been seen in a number of other studies as well. So this is just one plot that I included in that paper, using the high-split dispersion model to sort of quantify the impact that those emissions have on downwind regions. So again, there are a number of studies using ground-based measurements of this nature, but in this case, because we were able to essentially fly through this plume using the C-130, we wanted to take these studies a step further. So here are the measurements that we made during Research Flight 15 of NOMADSS. So on the left-hand side, you can see the C-130 flight track, and I've color-coded that using our total mercury measurements on board the C-130. We spent about 90 minutes, about 3 hours actually flying over the lake, trying to find the plume. And eventually we found it kind of towards the later part of that 3-hour window as we got sort of low enough over the lake, down around 450 meters over the lake, and we were kind of in the right position and at the right altitude to actually intersect that plume. So you can see that here in our total mercury measurements. You can see the spike that took place at the same time as we saw enhancements in things like NOx and SO2 and CO and several other pollutants, but I'm going to focus on those 3 here. So as the C-130 passed through it and we realized we'd finally found that plume that we were looking for, we circled back around and sampled it a second time, which is this second enhancement here that you can see on both the top and the bottom. So kind of zooming in on that time period, on the left-hand side, you can see the 72-hour FLEXPART trajectories corresponding with the time when we observed these 2 plume enhancements, demonstrating the southwest flow that we were looking for and showing flow across that Chicago-Gary urban industrial area. And you can see kind of the zoomed-in plot of our total mercury measurements and of the NOx, SO2, and CO measurements. The reason that the mercury data looks like this sort of step function is, again, because we have a 2.5-minute integrated sample, whereas for NOx and CO, we have 1-second data, and for SO2, we had 10-second data. So I'm showing 10-second average measurements on the bottom plot corresponding with our measurements up above. Now, one thing that jumps out right away is that you can see in the first passage through the plume, the CO peak is offset from both the NOx and the SO2, indicating that this is not a perfectly well mixed plume. Perhaps we're seeing maybe a couple different emission sources kind of offset from one another, whereas in the second passage of the plume, the 3 enhancements all kind of line up nicely with one another. So we explore that in a little bit more detail in the data. I'll show a little bit of that now, and I can talk about that more afterwards if we have a little bit more time. But basically what I wanted to do is, following Jesse's method, see if we could compute these measured enhancement ratios of mercury to CO, mercury to SO2, mercury to NOx, and then compare that to what's reported in the inventories, because these 3 pollutants are all reported in the National Emissions Inventory in the same way that the mercury data is available. So I'm showing here just the observations of mercury to the 3 other pollutants. So I have mercury to CO on the left, mercury to NOx in the middle, and mercury to SO2 on the right-hand side. And this is for the 2 plume passages together. And I did this because, again, our mercury measurements are on 2.5-minute time resolution. So by lumping both plumes together, we were able to use more data in computing these regressions. We did also do this separately for the 2 plume passages separately from one another, which is what you can see here on the bottom. So what I've called those is plumes A and B, the 2 plume passages. So here are the regressions that we computed for both plume passages together and then the 2 plumes separately from one another. And we did the same thing using the when I also computed an emission or enhancement ratios of NOx to CO, SO2 to CO, and NOx to SO2, but I'm focusing here on the mercury data just for now. So again, this is using a combination of air mass back trajectories and our measurements to determine when we were in the plume, and then computing these measured enhancement ratios. So then, in order to compare this to the inventory, in collaboration with Christoph Note, who was here for several years, and I think some of you know quite well, he performed a FLEXPART footprint analysis for me. So we basically combined the FLEXPART model with the National Emissions Inventory to simulate what we should have measured at the C130 if, in fact, those emissions inventories were correct. We did account for the fact that there can be loss of NOx and SO2 from the emission source to the point where we measured it, and we corrected these emissions ratios for that loss of NOx and SO2, assuming that reaction with OH is the primary loss mechanism, and that is the same method that Jesse used in his paper as well. So we then, similar to Jesse, compared the observed enhancement ratios with the inventoried emissions ratios to see how well we think the inventory is doing at quantifying total mercury emissions from Chicago-Gary. So again, as I said, we used the footprint analysis to come up with these inventoried emission ratios and compare them to our observations. And just to give you an example here, this is the total mercury to CO ratio in our measurements and in the emissions inventory for these two plume crossings. And what we find is that the inventory, again, is significantly biased low for total mercury emissions compared to our observations. And we can conclude that this is primarily driven by an underestimate in mercury emissions, because when we look at the measured enhancement ratios and inventoried emissions ratios for the other pollutants, so NOx to CO, SO2 versus CO, and NOx to SO2, we find much better agreement in our observations compared to the inventory. I don't have those numbers here. They're in the paper that I'm preparing right now, but basically we can see that there's much better agreement in those enhancement ratios, but for all of the mercury-based ratios that we computed, we find the inventory to be biased low. So just to summarize the implications of this analysis, from both my work and also building off of Jesse's work, we find that the emissions inventory is biased low for mercury from coal-fired power plants. But again, when we're looking at outflow from Chicago-Gary, we're not only looking at coal-fired power plants, we're looking at this sort of collection of all these other sources in the region. So what we infer is that this additional low bias that we find in the emissions ratios is that there may be other smaller sources that are collectively are not very well accounted for in the inventory. So when you sum up the emissions from all those smaller sources together, they're a significant source of mercury from the Chicago-Gary area. We also know that re-emission of legacy mercury can be a significant source of mercury to the local atmosphere. So that's mercury that has been emitted by either a natural or anthropogenic source to the atmosphere. It has been deposited, say, to the lake surface or to vegetation or to the soils, and then it has been re-emitted to the atmosphere. That's something that we don't have a great handle on yet in terms of how to quantify that. There's a number of studies looking at that, but several studies have shown that this could be a potential source that would not be accounted for in the emissions inventory, but may be affecting what we're measuring on board the C-130. Even considering these two factors here, we can still say from Jesse's work and from other work that's been done in the past that reductions in mercury emissions from coal-fired power plants will significantly decrease regional concentrations of atmospheric mercury and therefore deposition of mercury to ecosystems. So the effect of the MATS ruling will still have a significant impact, even if these two factors here are important sources of mercury in an urban industrial area like Chicago-Gary. Okay, so that's my first NOMADSS related mercury paper. That's something that I just recently presented at AGU and that I'm in the process of preparing to submit to atmospheric environment in the next couple of weeks. So I just want to spend the rest of my time talking about the other work that I've done looking at free tropospheric mercury chemistry. And this is a little bit of a shift, but it sort of takes you to the next stage if you are working your way through this diagram and what actually happens to mercury once it's in the atmosphere. The work that I'm going to talk about now, I recently published in Geophysical Research Letters in December, so you can find that paper in the literature if you want more information. So essentially the issue here is that mercury gets emitted to the atmosphere, and as I mentioned, the elemental form of mercury is a global pollutant. It can last in the atmosphere for weeks to months. The removal of elemental mercury from that sort of global pool happens once that elemental mercury is oxidized. So it's really important for us to understand how elemental mercury is oxidized to that oxidized form. And we don't have a great handle on that yet. So a number of studies had initially proposed that ozone and hydroxyl radical might be the dominant oxidants, but recent studies have suggested that that mechanism may not actually, it may actually be too slow to proceed in the atmosphere to be consistent with the observations that are available. So we've been looking for other oxidants that might be important. And one of the dominant global oxidants that's been proposed is actually bromine in the atmosphere. And this has been observed in polar environments, especially in springtime when we have large fluxes of things like bromine and chlorine to the atmosphere. We have these mercury depletion events, so we actually have this rapid oxidation of elemental mercury from the atmosphere. This has also been observed in the Dead Sea. So again, in places where we actually have really high concentrations, showing that this mechanism does take place, that bromine and chlorine can oxidize mercury in the atmosphere. And the question has been whether this is important on the global scale, in the global background atmosphere. So in general, it's just important to note that there's a lot of uncertainty in the mechanisms that have been proposed and the kinetics that go along with them. So we really wanted to try to understand this a little bit better. So to do that, we're going to look at data from Research Flight 6, which was really targeting the free troposphere in a part of the U.S. where the models like GeosChem have been suggesting that there's this pool of elevated oxidized mercury in the free troposphere. And again, we're thinking about the free troposphere because we're trying to understand this sort of global background transport in this global pool of mercury and how the oxidation mechanism might be taking place. So our colleagues who run GeosChem have shown that there's this pool of oxidized mercury that appears to be present kind of over the southern, southwestern part of the United States. And as part of NOMADSS, we really wanted to see if that's in fact there or if it was maybe an artifact of the GeosChem model. So we chose a flight on a day when the model was predicting elevated levels of oxidized mercury in the free troposphere. And so on Research Flight 6, we flew to central Texas and spent about 90 minutes flying around the free troposphere over Texas at a relatively constant altitude of about 7 kilometers, so in the middle towards upper troposphere. I will note that there's another paper about this topic in the literature right now by my colleague Viral Shah, who did all of the GeosChem modeling for this project. And whereas I focus on this one particular flight and looking at the chemical mechanism for mercury oxidation, he has looked at all of our free tropospheric mercury measurements from NOMADSS and comparing them against GeosChem. And that paper is now in ACP if you're interested. But I can say from his work, from looking at all of our NOMADSS data, in general, we did find that oxidized mercury concentrations were higher in the free troposphere than they were in the boundary layer. And so again, I'm going to kind of provide a case study looking at a period where we saw consistently enhanced oxidized mercury in the free troposphere and trying to understand the source mechanism there. So this is a little bit of a busy figure, but I will try to kind of walk my way through it. This is directly from my paper. So basically, you can see here on the bottom, the black line is the C-130 altitude for the duration of Research Flight 6. So we took off from Smyrna and spent some time kind of flying around in the lower atmosphere, did a boundary layer segment, and as we got over to Texas, we ascended up into the free troposphere. As we ascended up to that 7 kilometers cruising altitude, we saw that water vapor dropped off significantly, and ozone actually dropped off significantly as well. So we basically ascended into this very dry air mass that based on our observations, not just of ozone, but of all of the other species that we measured on board the C-130, we concluded was an air mass that was essentially an aged free tropospheric air mass. It had not been recently influenced by boundary layer emissions. It had not been recently influenced by the stratosphere. If we were seeing stratospheric subsidence into this layer, we would expect to see higher levels of ozone. And in fact, the average ozone concentration for this entire 90-minute period was only about 30 parts per billion. So it was relatively low. And again, we'll look at the trajectories in a moment to show kind of the origins of this air mass as well. So as we ascended into the free troposphere, you can see that in the boundary layer, our oxidized mercury concentrations, which are those little black dots, were below our detection limit in the boundary layer, and as we ascended into the free troposphere, we saw consistently elevated oxidized mercury throughout this air mass. We also saw consistently elevated levels of bromine monoxide, which was measured by the mini DOAS operated by the group from UCLA, and this was really one of the first times that we had measurements of BRO and oxidized mercury simultaneously to really look at this chemistry in the free troposphere. So we then computed, these are high split back trajectories, 14-day back trajectories from that portion of the C-130 flight where we saw this elevated oxidized mercury. And what we saw was basically that this air mass spent several days kind of circulating within the Pacific high pressure system in the upper part of the troposphere before subsiding by about 2 to 3 kilometers down to the altitude where we were sampling with the C-130. So we basically had, again, several days of circulating around here, the potential for this dry, subsiding air mass to undergo oxidation, mercury oxidation, before this transport and subsidence to where we measured it with the C-130. And given the elevated levels of BRO that we observed simultaneously and the low levels of ozone, we hypothesized that, in fact, bromine was the dominant oxidant in this case. But we wanted to be able to sort of prove that the chemistry really holds up with what we observed. So the group from UCLA carried out a chemical box model using the proposed oxidation mechanism of elemental mercury by bromine, constraining the model by the observations that we had from the C-130 and running it over the course of 14 days to see if we could generate sufficient oxidized mercury to match our observations and to demonstrate that the BRO and the oxidized mercury could be maintained over that many days in the free troposphere. So this plot here shows the results of that chemical box model. So we basically initialized the model with the amount of elemental mercury that we observed from the C-130, and we looked to see how many days it would take to essentially simulate the amount of oxidized mercury that we measured on board the C-130. What we found is that after a range of 8 to 13 days, based on the different sensitivity tests that we ran, that we were able to generate the measured amounts of BRO and oxidized mercury that we measured on board the C-130. So the box model was consistent with what the high split trajectories showed and with what we measured on board the C-130 after this many days of transport. So this told us that the bromine radicals and oxidized mercury could persist in the air mass, and that bromine was capable of doing the oxidation that we suspected was the source of the mercury that we were measuring. But we still needed to take this one step further because much of the mercury community still argues that perhaps ozone and the hydroxyl radical are important oxidants of mercury in the atmosphere, that this has not been fully disproven. So we ran the box model again, taking out oxidation by bromine and adding in the mechanism that's been proposed for oxidation by ozone and OH. And when we run the model that way, we find that elemental mercury oxidation by that other mechanism of OH and ozone is only able to explain about 20% of the oxidized mercury that we observed during research flight 6, whereas when we run the model with the bromine oxidation mechanism, we're actually able to simulate what we measured on board the C-130. So our conclusion was that the model is confirming atomic bromine as the dominant oxidant of elemental mercury in this free tropospheric air mass, and perhaps maybe the dominant mechanism in the certain parts of the free troposphere, and that these high-pressure systems, like the Pacific High, these semi-permanent highs, may be important places to better understand this oxidation of mercury, and may be kind of a source region that we need to think about a little bit more. And in fact, Viral's paper looks at that in a little bit more detail and looks at a couple of other cases, considering the role of these semi-permanent highs of dry subsiding air that may play a role in atmospheric mercury oxidation. So again, just to summarize, the NOMADSS campaign provided the first observations of enhanced oxidized mercury and BRO in the free troposphere, where much of this global oxidation by bromine is anticipated to take place. So we went to the part of the atmosphere where this mechanism is proposed to be important, and we in fact observed the ability for bromine to be the main oxidant in this subtropical free troposphere, and we're proposing that subtropical high pressure systems may be key locations in the global mercury cycle, and perhaps important locations to consider for any future airborne measurements of bromine and these halogen species. So I just want to use my last slide here to conclude by talking about kind of where I'm going with my research now that I'm here at Colorado College. So you can see that the two kind of main themes of the NOMADSS work are carrying through into my ongoing work. So in terms of looking at local and regional atmospheric mercury emissions, one thing I plan to do this summer is to collect some continuous ground-based measurements of total atmospheric mercury and try to better understand the impact that the Martin Drake Power Plant, which is right smack in the middle of downtown Colorado Springs, potentially has on atmospheric mercury concentrations and mercury deposition to our ecosystem. This is a very controversial power plant. A lot of questions are out there about its compliance with SO2 standards. It's a very old plant. There are a lot of controversy around it, but as far as I can tell, no one's really ever measured ambient mercury near that plant. So I plan to do that this summer. I'm also working on a collaboration with another colleague of mine at Colorado College, Rebecca Barnes, who has been doing work looking at carbon and nitrogen cycling in wildfire sites around Colorado and looking at ecosystem recovery. She's continuing that work this summer, and I'm actually planning to kind of tag along at her field sites and collect some soil samples to analyze for mercury concentrations and try to kind of back out atmospheric emissions of mercury from those fires, which has been done in some other sites in the literature. And because she's already looking at kind of a compare and contrast of different burn sites, we're going to see if we can do something interesting looking at mercury content in soils. In terms of continuing to think about free tropospheric mercury chemistry, I've been talking with some colleagues of mine at the University of Michigan who really specialize in doing mercury isotope analysis. And one of the things we're considering is trying to get up to a high elevation site and actually collect samples that are truly sort of background atmospheric mercury, not recently influenced by sources, and be able to actually measure the isotopic signature of sort of the background pool of mercury. Again, this is something I'm doing with collaborators at the University of Michigan who are able to do the very sort of complex laboratory and analytical work related to that. We're going to maybe just collect a handful of samples this summer and see where that takes us. But I'm certainly open to discussing other new possible research collaborations, especially here within Colorado. We have a lot of students who are really excited about getting out in the field and getting research experience, and they're great students. So I've been having some interesting conversations this morning, and I'm really excited to actually be here in Colorado in a really great part of the state to do atmospheric chemistry research, part of the country. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you have about this work.
I was just curious about, you looked at BRO in above Texas, but is chlorine an issue at all up there, or did anyone measure chlorine and chlorine radicals too?
We didn't have any chlorine radical measurements on board the C-130. Most of the studies in the literature have really been proposing bromine as the dominant oxidant, and so and that was the measurement that we had available to us. It doesn't mean that chlorine isn't playing a role, but a lot of the modeling studies and any of the available measurement studies have really been giving a lot of attention to bromine recently.
I've read that a lot of deposition of mercury is right near the power plants, like in the first maybe 30 miles or something like that. But it doesn't seem like there would be time for it to oxidize. So it's just the elemental form falling. Is that less of a public health risk?
So if it gets emitted in the elemental form, it's not likely to be removed by precipitation because the elemental form is not very water soluble. So the power plants are putting out both elemental and oxidized fractions. So the oxidized mercury that's emitted can be deposited very quickly, and there are studies that have shown, again, these like kind of hot spots around power plants and other sources, whereas the elemental form may stay in the atmosphere longer. But there's a lot that we also don't understand very well at what's happening within the plume. So there's been a couple studies that have tried to look at in-plume reduction, oxidized mercury going back to the elemental form, which would not allow it to be removed very quickly. So, I mean, that's part of the reason that the clean air mercury rule wasn't really upheld, because of this very complex chemistry. Mercury doesn't just go up and stay up. If it's in the oxidized form, it can get removed really quickly.
Thanks. So I was wondering what Geochem was using for why it saw a pool of mercury, and was it including the bromine oxidation?
Yeah, so the Geochem mercury model is primarily using the bromine oxidation mechanism now, but you can use either, right? Both. Initially, it was developed with the ozone hydroxyl radical oxidation mechanism. There's a paper by Chris Holmes who added this bromine mechanism in, and they're proposing that really is the dominant mechanism. So my colleague Viral Shah, actually, let me back up. So they were using the bromine mechanism when they were projecting that pool of mercury over the southern U.S. What we found, and I didn't really talk about here, but I think it's important to note, is that green line is showing what Geochem is simulating we should have observed on that flight, and it's underestimating our observations. So Geochem predicts the enhancement, but it doesn't get the magnitude of it right. And depending on which flight from NOMADSS you look at, it's off by a factor of, I think, 2 to 5, somewhere in that ballpark. And so that's actually what Viral's paper is looking at. And his work is suggesting that, in fact, this oxidation mechanism may be faster than we think. So he played around with looking at different rate constants for the mechanism itself, and also played around with looking at the level of bromine that's actually in the model, that maybe there's an underestimate in the atmospheric bromine, or that we don't have the rate constant right. And there's several different papers. There's a range of rate constants in the literature that you could consider for that mechanism, and his paper looks at that in more detail. And he actually ran the model using the OH ozone chemistry separately, and found that it doesn't come close to simulating what we measured overall in terms of free tropospheric oxidized mercury.
All right, if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank you again. It was a great talk.
Great.
And also, we are going to have lunch together in the cafeteria. So who wants to join and who has more questions is welcome to join there.
Thank you again.